still plenty that needs to happen. We have a gold star panel consisting of Anita Cameron, the Director of Minority Outreach for Not Dead Yet, Denise Figeuroa, the Executive Director at the Independent Living Center of the Hudson Valley here in Troy, New York, Gregg, the Director of Policy and Development for the Center for Disability Rights in Rochester, and John Farina, member of the Capital District chapter of the American Council for the Blind. This panel will also be divided into 2 podcast episodes for our Empowering Independence podcast here from Consumer Directed Choices. I'm going to ask each panelist now to take some time and introduce themselves. We are going in alphabetical order. We'll start with Anita Cameron from Not Dead Yet.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good morning. My name's Anita Cameron. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am Director of Minority Outreach with Not Dead Yet. And I think that's it. I tend to ramble and go on and everything. I'm not as controlled as everyone else. And so I'm trying to be very cognizant of that. And so I think I'm done for now. Thank you.
That's part of the reason why we wanted you here, Anita, is that you are not as controlled as the rest of us here. So it is great to have you, Denise Figeuroa.
Good morning, everybody. Denise Figeuroa, as Blaise said, I'm the director of the Independent Living Center of the Hudson Valley in Troy and in Hudson. I have been around a few years doing the disability rights thing and independent living. I grew up with my disability. I had polio as an infant, so I am a wheelchair user. I have been involved in disability rights since I started college when I was 17. So I saw the ADA pass, but before that I saw Section 504 of the Rehab Act and advocated for that as well. Good morning. It's good to be here with everybody.
Thank you very much, Denise. It's great to have you here. Gregg, go ahead.
Before I say anything about myself, Anita's very modest, but I mean, I think it needs to be said she is a legend in our community and has put her life and her body on the line for disability rights too many times to count. I had the privilege of my first arrest for disability rights standing right next to her. And that was, I was 100 and something for her. It was #1 for me. We've since been arrested many times together, but Anita is a little too modest, and I think because of that, you know, doesn't get her due in our community, but she is a legend. My name is Gregg Beratan. I am the Director of Advocacy and Development at the Center for Disability Rights. I'm also the co-founder, along with Alice Wong and Andrew Pulrang, of Crypt the Vote, which is an online campaign to bring disability into the national political sphere. It's interesting to me to hear Denise say that, you know, she's been in disability rights for so long, and she has, and is rightfully a member of the Disability Rights Hall of Fame for New York for that reason. For me, my journey to disability rights was a lot longer. I spent probably, I mean, I've been disabled all my life, learning disabilities, neurodivergent, you can call it what you will. But I spent probably the first 15 years after a diagnosis running from a disabled identity. And so really, it's been a hard time learning to seek accommodations that the ADA made possible, and coming into owning a disabled identity has been a really long journey for me. But eventually getting there is what's made all the difference in my life, and finding this community.
Thank you very much, Gregg. Last but certainly not least, John Farina.
Good morning. Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I am a retired guy for the most part in Albany, New York. I've been a guide dog user for more years than I can count. I think, well, not really, but I think it was 1974. So my current dog is the 7th dog from the Seeing Eye. And I transitioned from cane to dog in college, as a lot of people do, actually, looking back on my classes. And I often try to figure out how long I've been a member of Capital District, a chapter of American Council of the Blind, and I honestly don't know, unless somebody can tell me. It was probably in the 80s, but only got really more involved after getting married and being able to actually travel more easily to local meetings, because I lived where the local meetings were. So grew up in a small town of Mechanicville, north of here, and spent my school career at public schools, Siena College, University at Albany. And to go back just a little bit, in those days, which were the 50s/60s, graduated in 1971, for a lot of folks, public school who were visually impaired, public school was not necessarily the option. A lot of folks ended up at residential schools for the blind/visually impaired, and that's a whole nother debate that we won't go into here. But for me, public school was personally a good option, and I'll let you move on to the next person.
Thank you very much, John. This is going to be a pretty informal conversation with each of the 4 panelists you have heard from. We are going to briefly pause in between each panelist because this is being captioned as well as translated into ASL. I'm going to, again, go in alphabetical order here with the first question, which is intentionally pretty open and up for your interpretation. What does the ADA mean to you? We'll start with you, Anita.
Hi, well, wow. It means a lot. I guess I better kind of go a little into my background. I was born in Chicago in 1965. I was a twin, and my parents had no idea that I was coming. And so my twin sister was born on one day, and a few hours later, my mom went into labor and had me on another day. and was almost died at birth. And
Did we
one of
lose
the things
Anita?
that happened was they used too much oxygen, and it took away almost all of my eyesight.
You,
Um,
Anita, can
I
you?
was mainstreamed.
Because we lost you there for a bit.
I'm hearing Anita, and so is the interpreter.
Okay.
I was mainstreamed from preschool through university. And when I started school, disabled kids didn't even have the right to an education. And so that's kind of where I, school without going into a whole bunch of stuff. I was certainly a beneficiary of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was real new by the time I was in the 4th grade. And so they had all kinds of cool little bells and whistles that they used on, with me. So I got all kinds of accommodations in elementary school. In high school, unfortunately, I did not get those because I was so-called gifted, and so they felt that even with my multiple disabilities, that because I had a couple of brain cells to rub together, I didn't need accommodations. I remember I started college at 16 at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I remember that we had nothing. Disabled students had nothing. There were no accommodations. It was like, oh, you're disabled, you need accommodations. Huh? Sucks to be you. I remember a math professor told me when I wanted to record, because, hey, I couldn't really take notes. I was told that I was being lazy. And so I just was kind of on my own. As I said, because I was so-called gifted, I got out of college real early and entered medical school. And unfortunately, my disabilities then began to, I started losing more eyesight. My seizures got way out of control. And I was asked to, say goodbye because the ADA didn't exist back then. And nobody really knew how to deal with medical students with disabilities. And so I was asked to leave. And I did, and I was really depressed, but actually it turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because a couple of years later, I found ADAPT. Interestingly enough, while in college, I had my first couple of jobs, and one job I had as a service clerk for a food chain, famous food chain in Chicago called Jules. I was a very good worker, but I was a little slow. And so I was told one day that, I was being terminated. They told me that, yeah, we know that you're blind, but you're really slow. And so we're going to have to let you go. And I remember thinking, man, one of these days, I hope and pray that, somebody doesn't get fired just because they're disabled. I did everything right. I was never missed a day of work, was on time, did overtime, did whatever they wanted, but, they saw fit to. I didn't realize that 7 years after I had my little dream that that dream will come true. And that was the Americans with Disabilities Act. And, ostensibly, supposedly, you can't get fired just because you're disabled. You know, if you're doing your job, you know, and the central functions of your job, you know, I just needed a couple of accommodations that would have cost nothing. And so, wow, there was the Americans with Disabilities Act. One job I had, I was working at Chicago Transit Authority as a transportation information agent. And one of my coworkers was a woman named Judy Savage, and she used a wheelchair. But I noticed that, hey, she was never on the buses, you know. I never saw her on the buses. I always wondered, you know, how come I never got to ride, you know, to work with Judy? And that was because buses had no lifts for folks in wheelchairs. And I was 19 at that time. I didn't realize 2 years later I would join ADAPT and I would be chaining myself to buses and putting my body in front of buses and things of that nature to block them, you know, so that there would be lifts on buses, so folks who use wheelchairs could ride the buses like everybody else. And so, you know, the ADA, it means quite a lot to me. My first job after the ADA went into effect was I worked for Anderson Windows. And Anderson Windows is like high-end, rich people's windows. And I did customer service at Anderson, and it was a very complex job. And I remember that at that time I was, you know, using my wheelchair, and they very readily, I mean, almost without me asking, you know, they were like, what do you need? You know, and so there were a number of reasonable accommodations that they did for me. They had these huge big old books which I couldn't really lift, and so they broke those down for me. They put my desk on blocks so that I could get my wheelchair under. My seizures were active then, and we had a plan that if I had a seizure at work, instead of, you know, they listened to me about what to deal with it, and oftentimes it just involved a few minutes of rest in a dark room, and that's what they did. And it was just amazing because it felt so good, you know, and so many things, you know, curb cuts and being able to get into buildings and all of that. And, you know, but I knew back then, and I know now, I mean, as great as the Americans with Disabilities Act is, in some ways it didn't go far enough. In quite a few ways, it puts the burden on people with disabilities to be watchdogs, you know, and report. But hey, that's a lot better than nothing. I get chills when I hear people who weren't born at the time of the ADA. You know, I did the Capitol Crawl, and I was 24 years old when we did that Capitol Crawl. And so much, you know, went through my mind as I was going up those stairs. I was, for the first 40 steps, carrying my friend's wheelchair up backwards. Frank McComb from Denver, I was carrying his wheelchair up backwards. But it was hot that day. And I could only do that for, you know, a little while. So I passed his wheelchair off to his attendant. And then I went backwards up those stairs on my butt. I just have so many memories of that day. And yeah, I mean, the ADA, it means so much to me. And I am honored and humbled that I, that I got to help make history. You know, I was born too late to participate in the civil rights movement for Black folks. And I always felt guilty about that, about being born too late. And so I made a vow as a young child that I would work to make the world a better place. And so at 16, I got involved in social justice. And at 21, I found ADAPT in the disability rights movement. And it has been, it's being involved in disability rights has been what has made my life, completed my life. So yeah, thanks. I'm gonna stop now.
Blaze, we're not hearing you if you're talking. I'm trying to unmute you and it's not working. Now you're unmuted. Try now.
Thank you. I'm just going to stay unmuted and shut my mic on and off. That I think is going to be easiest. So, Anita, that was truly fascinating. And I learned so much from you. Thank you very much for that insight. Denise, what was life like for you before the ADA, and what does the ADA mean to you?
Well, you know, much like Anita growing up, there was no ADA. I was born in the 1950s, 1954 to be exact, and I contracted polio, as I said, as an infant. So I grew up my entire life with my disability. I used braces and crutches to get around as a kid until I was actually in college. And the attitude about disability was, you know, you pretty much, you know, had access to nothing. You know, the buses weren't accessible, the buildings weren't accessible. Even though I could climb stairs, it was a struggle to get in. I couldn't use public transit. I started school in a small community, and so I was the only child with a disability. And in many ways, it was a blessing because they knew I needed to go to school, or at least accepted the fact that I should be going to school, and sent a cab for me to get there, so that instead of trying to get into the school bus. As I said, I was the only kid in the community, so I guess they could manage to do that contract with a cab company. But when I came to New York City, I had this rude awakening. We moved back to New York City when I was in second grade. And you know, I was born in New York, moved to Connecticut, came back. And when I came back, I discovered that kids with disabilities were separated into what they called health conservation classes. I wasn't allowed to go to school with my siblings. I had 4 sisters. They all went to one public school, and I had to be bused to another public school. And I discovered when I went to that public school that they had 4 grades in one classroom. So the goal wasn't education, it was your health conservation. There was very little educating going on in those classes. I kept complaining to my mother that I already knew most of the work because I had been in regular classes when I was in Connecticut. And so after a couple of years, and finally leaving the fourth grade, going into the fifth grade, and taking home my third grade math book over the summer to read before I went to fifth grade class. And I showed my parents. My mom and dad, finally realized, oh, there's something wrong here, So they ended up taking me out of public school. I ended up going to Catholic school. Not that we could afford it, they let me go there pretty much at no cost because our family was not wealthy. I finished out my grammar school in Catholic school. And it was really the only saving grace, because I'm not sure that I would have ever learned anything in public school at the time, And so, I got to see the contrast at a pretty early age of how it was to be integrated in classrooms versus being segregated because of your disability. And, much like Gregg talked about, running away from your disability growing up, it wasn't anything I embraced. I certainly didn't want to be treated like a person with a disability because that wasn't seen as anything positive. There was no pride in being a person with a disability. You were spending all of your time trying to deny that you were, and it wasn't until I got to college and met other kids with disabilities, other teenagers, 20-year-olds, et cetera, with disabilities that talked about being proud of their disability and that they had certain rights. And that was when, that was in 1972. It was prior to the Section 504 of the Rehab Act, but we already had a disabled students organization at the Brooklyn College campus, which was part of City University. We were actually the first City University campus to be accessible. So there had been 4 students there who were advocating in the 70s, in the early 70s, for accessibility to the campus, had some demonstrations and created an organization called So Fed Up, which was the student organization for Every Disability United for Progress. And so you could be an officer in that club if you could remember their name. Anyway, so that was really how I got involved and where I got my passion for disability rights was at college, being exposed to other people and learning that my disability shouldn't be a deficit, that it should be something I should be proud of, and that I had rights like anybody else. And so I started advocating along with the other students and going to marches, and school was kind of secondary, but I really got into getting into the organizing, not only on the college campus, but also with Disabled in Action, which was a consumer organization started by Judy Newman, who many folks know is one of the, is one of the leaders in the community, and certainly, with Ed Roberts, was at the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley. But Judy started out in New York, and she started DIA, and that's really where I learned and met so many other advocates and leaders in the community, people that became leaders in the community. I was just very fortunate at the time. The time was right, and the place was right for me to do that. And so, as I said, I was part of the Independent Living Center already here in Troy. When the ADA came about, and when the hearings were being held by Justin Dart around the country, collecting testimony, it was so empowering to listen to other people, and so sad to listen to the stories of other people being discriminated against in employment, in institutions, in other places, and so it just gave all of us more ammunition, basically, to be able to advocate for the ADA. And what the ADA has meant to me, although there's so much more that needs to be done, I think anybody looking around, looking at buildings, looking at transportation, there is more that's accessible, but it's the physical world that's changed. we still have so many barriers that we face in employment and in attitudes, and in making sure that people understand the breadth of disability, and that it's not just people in wheelchairs and not just blind people, not just deaf people, but that there are all these layers that need to be addressed, and that's the harder work that needs to get done. So I'll leave it at that so we can move on to other folks.
Thank you for the cue, Denise. I'm more on top of it this time. Gregg, the same question to you.
I was thinking about this, and I think in many ways I've been shaped by the fact that I, like Denise and Anita, I grew up before the ADA was passed. And when I first understood myself as disabled in any way was about 15, even though I'd experienced ableism in other ways throughout my life. And because I think that was in an educational setting, I was in school, I'd been told that I could ask for accommodations, but every time I did, even largely through university, I was made to feel like a fraud, that I was gaming the system, that I was asking for an advantage that no one else had. And I think I probably, because of this, and because, again, I did not fully identify at the time, I probably didn't really notice beyond a headline that the ADA had been passed, or that had been signed on July 26, 1990. I started hearing more about it, I guess, my last couple years of university, 93, 94, as the university started to grapple with what it meant for them. But even then, I mean, I don't, there was a sense that, I'd taken on a lot of this internalized ableism, that I was a fraud for even contemplating a disabled identity. And so to think that this law applied to me and not just folks in wheelchairs was hard for me to grasp. And strangely enough, I mean, it was leaving the country and seeing another system in work. And, when I moved to England for grad school in I'm going to say 94. And in England, it's a system based on privilege. It's not a system based on rights. So privileges are granted to disabled people rather than rights, and privileges obviously can be taken away. And understanding that, and at the same time starting to read disabled writers and understanding that this was a broad, vibrant community, and seeing shared experiences of ableism in other people's experiences who didn't necessarily, have my disabilities, weren't necessarily, some had physical disabilities, some had developmental disabilities. People writing about this shared experience of ableism is what led me to sort of look at what the ADA was, and look at, other laws. I mean, I did my PhD focused on IDEA, but it wasn't until I understood that shared experience that I was able to really sort of try and understand that the ADA applied to me. And that was liberating. I mean, I think, the first time I comfortably put disabled on a job application without worrying that it would keep me from getting that job, and thinking that, well, if it does, it's probably not a job I want, but they're also breaking the law. That was a huge thing for me. And I think that really, that's when I started to look at what the ADA meant, and see the impact that it had on so many in our community. That said, it's not the final solution, as I think everyone else has already said. I mean, Anita and I just, 2 years ago, were dragged out of Congress because a bunch of Congress people from both sides of the aisle decided that they were going to push a bill, HR 620, to gut the ADA. They wanted to force people to wait 180 days before they could get any sort of satisfaction on an ADA violation. And so this is A, under threat, but B, clearly doesn't go far enough, because people are making the case that business rights outweigh a person's right to access that business. And even other sections of the ADA, I mean, we still have to fight government for interpreters. We still have to fight government to provide long-term care in the form of home and community-based services. Things that the courts have said we have a right to under the ADA, but we've had to fight Olmstead cases case by case. It hasn't been a blanket, okay, the ADA says this, so everyone gets to live in the community. We've ended up having to fight for it on a case by case basis, and I think that's where we're falling short, and I think that's where the ADA probably isn't enough. We need to be more explicit. I mean, we've changed it once already when the courts ruled that it wasn't explicit enough, and we made it more explicit and took it back to what we thought it was intended to do in the first place. But there's much more that needs to be done.
Thank you very much, Gregg. John, over to you.
I was just thinking, when you do the calculations and you realize that 30 years was obviously 1990, when the ADA was passed, Kathy and I were just not too far away from being married, which, that's a significant period of time. I think I was lucky in my journey, because as Denise and other people have talked about their education experience, maybe it was growing up in a small community, being the only visually impaired student. The schools, I like to say that the school did what they needed without the law. Now that's a little different than what has to happen today sometimes. But there was not a whole lot of advocacy involved, other than getting them to see that, yes, I could stay in the regular program. And that happened about kindergarten, and they never thought about that again. So they fortunately were creative enough when they needed to be for math and things of that nature. In college, there was a disability, well, there certainly was a disability resource center at the university. There was a sort of a shadow one, we'll call it, at Siena, which has definitely grown into more now. But that it was the time, and that's okay. But learning how to advocate with with professors and people at work was a good experience, and is a good experience. And hopefully people today, even though we have all the resources supposedly available in many cases, I hope that young people are still learning, and I try to teach them when I'm working with them as assistive technology students who are blind or visually impaired, that sometimes you have to be able to advocate for your needs. Because just because we've all said, just because the law is there doesn't mean that everybody's going to provide them. and how you advocate, sets you up in terms of probably getting your needs or being seen as somebody who's a pain in the butt. And it's okay to be a pain in the butt, but you gotta know what that you're going to get the end result. As a guide dog user, what I've seen is that, as Denise and others have said, the physical changes to the surroundings have certainly been profound. In terms of training dogs now, our dogs find the curb cut as opposed to what they used to find was a curb. And they go from curb cut to curb cut, which those of you who can see know is not always necessarily in a totally straight line, but they learn to do that kind of thing. It can target ramps. You can find that accessible pedestrian signals to help you with street crossings if you require that assistance, or help you figure out when the correct time might be. That kind of training for people in schools is certainly different. I never had orientation and mobility in school, but pretty much all the students I've worked with over the years have gotten O&M training, not just to get around the school environment, but many of them have gotten off-campus training to begin to learn how to ride buses successfully. So presumably by the time they get to college or a job, they're ready to be out in the community with much more training than maybe I had. And that goes to access, and it goes to people being willing to do that. So as everybody has said, it probably doesn't in some ways go far enough, but it's nice to have the law there. Unfortunately, it's interesting to see that in many situations, people still need to advocate for what they need. And I guess we're talking about changing attitudes. And we all know that whether it's disability rights or other rights or what we're seeing in society right now, it's hard to change those, and it takes a long time, and you have to have a sense of history, I guess, and that kind of thing. I'll leave it at that. Other than to say, Blaze, that as an FYI, and I'll let you know in the chat panel, I have another meeting that starts at 11. Got myself into two things today, so if I disappear on you, I'll let you know.
Thank you for letting me know. Let's be brief on this, because we all have said that the ADA needs to improve. I'm going to go in random order on this, and you can unmute accordingly. I'll start with you, John, since you do have the time constraint. In about a minute, what is one way you would like to see or you think needs to improve about the ADA?
Wow, hard question to there we go. Hard question to answer, I guess. I'm not sure I have a specific way, but I think to help people understand the complaint process, the advocacy process, is probably the biggest change. If maybe that can be streamlined or more easily understood, that would go a long way, not only to helping adults with disabilities, but helping parents to advocate on behalf of their disabled children.
Very well put. Denise, over to you.
Sorry, just trying to unmute there. Well, I don't know that it's so much as changing the ADA. as it is improving on the ADA. Well, first of all, we have to make sure that the ADA isn't diminished, because there are always efforts to weaken the ADA. There have been efforts over the years, as Gregg referred to, and there continue to be efforts to threaten the ADA as it exists. And so we need to always be vigilant about that. But we also need to improve, to start to address the institutional bias that exists, that keeps people living in institutions. The ADA is a broad-based civil rights piece of legislation, and we've had, the Olmstead decision of the Supreme Court said, was based on the ADA, and said that, people with disabilities have the right to live in the most integrated setting appropriate, and that states need to be making plans to make sure that people have options other than institutional settings. That hasn't happened. People are still living in institutions, and the funding streams that go that are set up in Medicaid and Medicare, it has a bias toward placing people in institutions, and that's the stuff that needs to get addressed. We need to be getting more home and community-based services to people. The employment situation for people with disabilities is horrendous. It's worse than any minority group in the country. We need to address, and if you happen to be Black or Puerto Rican and disabled, you're even worse off. So the layers of discrimination are incredible, and we need to do more about enforcement and education and training of the public, as well as people with disabilities, to get them into places where they can get decent jobs. So I'll leave it at that and leave it to others to add on.
Thank you, Denise. Anita, what is one improvement you would like to see for the ADA?
Well, actually, Denise kind of took my idea. and she's absolutely right. I think, though, when the ADA was first passed, I kept hearing two words in relation to the ADA: unfunded mandate. If I had $1 for every time I heard that term in relation to the ADA, I'd be a fairly wealthy woman. And so the ADA needs money. Fund it. Take some of the onus off of disabled people to report and complain and all. Put money into the ADA so that the gaps that I call in the ADA can be closed. The ADA needs money, and it needs a lot more respect than it gets. So I think that's where I am with that.
Anita, I laughed so hard at your comment about the wealthiness. That was fantastic. Gregg, the same question for you. What's one improvement you would like to see for the ADA?
Got to remember to unmute. Sorry. It's hard to go last on this panel because everyone is so knowledgeable, and I'm really gonna repeat a lot of what Denise said. When the ADA was passed, and this seems to get lost, and I can't take credit for remembering this. It was brought up in another panel I did recently by my friend Dara Baldwin. But when the ADA was passed, it was clear and it was explicit that it was about community integration, another two words. And somehow the powers that be have sort of twisted it into ramps and a vague notion of access. But I think we need to get back to this notion that community integration is at the heart of it, because we are still fighting New York State and pretty much in every other state to get people into the community, to fund home and community-based services so people can live their lives, so they don't have to risk going into, you know, the virus incubators that we've seen congregate settings to be, so they can have jobs once we convince people that hiring a disabled person is an asset and not some hardship that they have to consider. This is community integration is at the heart of this law, and we need to reinforce that. We need to build upon that. If that means being explicit and passing, you know, the Disability Integration Act or something else that ensures that people have further rights, so they don't have to go to court every time to prove that the community is the most integrated setting appropriate for everyone, then let's pass that. But I mean, I think I would love to see DIA pass, but I'd love to see us remember that community integration is at the heart of the ADA.
Well put by all of you. Time is not on our side. The Center for Disability Rights, not dead yet, Independent Living Center of the Hudson Valley, and the American Council of the Blind all are phenomenal resources and have great information on different advocacy. I will, in the post-webinar sphere of things, put all of the resources in an email and get those off to you. I cannot thank all of you for attending. I can't thank Anita, Denise, Gregg, and John enough for being so kind with your time and participating.
Thanks for having
I
us.
can't,
Chris.
sure. I can't thank Denise Denoto enough for being my Zoom IT person. Goodness knows I needed one. And to Denise Safranek for the interpretation. Thank you all very, very much. Let's make change happen. Stay well and safe.
Thanks, Blaze. See you later.
Happy ADA.
Happy ADA 30.
Thank you.
See you, folks.
Happy ADA.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Be well.
Bye.
Thank you.